part 2 of Rotherwood Plantation. So we will do a little recap here. We left off on Phibbs being just as cruel to his own family, and he also had a strange request about his death. And we had just learned about Aunt Vic Phibbs and Edward Stewart. So Aunt Vic told Stewart that Phibbs was often overheard stating that when he died, he wanted to be buried standing up on top of the hill at Rotherwood. And this is so he could always be looking down into the bottoms and see the slaves working. Phibbs had a daughter, Priscilla, who had fallen in love with a young man, a farmhand. The Civil War had struck, and her young suitor was called off to battle. Phibbs hated the young man so much that he had him murdered in action, telling his daughter what he did and why he did it. Priscilla herself died from depression and grief at the age of 20 as a widow. There was a short battle on the grounds of Rotherwood during the war, but as fate would have it, there was one last nightmarish tragedy set to unfold on the grounds, one that would leave its scars physically and echoes of terror for years to come. In the summer of 1861, Phibbs himself fell ill. The doctor could not explain his condition. He was feverish, almost delusional. Afraid of him being contagious, the cruel man, now overtaken by sickness, was moved out and quarantined into the carriage house. A young slave boy was assigned to keep watch over him and to fan him to keep him cool. For days, Phibbs lingered, half awake in fever with labored breathing, until finally death came for Phibbs in a way that only a man of his nature could deserve. In fact, no one has an explanation for his death or the circumstances in which it occurred. Can a man be so evil that death itself manifests directly and comes to take him from the world? Maybe. One sweltering afternoon, the slave boy was fanning Phibbs as he was assigned, when suddenly Phibbs, for the first time in days, snapped. Fully awake, his eyes constantly moving widely in their sockets, seemed to fixate on a point high in the air above and beyond the boy. Turning to see what his master saw, the boy himself let out a blood-curdling scream of absolute horror. A sickly, buzzing cloud had begun to form in mid-air, wriggling and swarming, and it took the boy all of 2 seconds to realize what it was. Hundreds of flies. The cloud of flies got thicker and thicker until finally the entire cloud itself descended onto Phibbs, covering his face, crawling and running all over his forehead, their tiny hairy legs poking into his open eyes as they roamed themselves up his nostrils, into his ears, and finally down his open, screaming mouth. The swarm was so thick that Phibbs finally started to suffocate, choking to death on the living, buzzing flies. The flies kept coming as the young boy, scared out of his mind, watched his master quickly go into spasms as his tormentor and owner's lungs filled with the insects, as Phibbs finally died with a buzzing death rattle. Finally, regaining his sense, the boy bolted off to the house to get help. When he returned with family and the doctor, Phibbs lay dead, his eyes staring up, his mouth slack and frozen on his face with a look of terror. There wasn't a fly in sight. They had vanished as though they never even existed at all. His death was something out of the books of hell, but Joshua Phibbs was not to be gotten rid of so easily. His funeral, even today, is something of legend around locals whose great-great-grandparents were there and who passed the story down to their descendants. The funeral of the most hated man in Kingsport was more of a social event of the summer than the sober occasion it had been. The casket was to be pulled by 2 large horses up and around to the cemetery plots on the ground. During the funeral, it seemed that a storm was coming, the wind picking up the skirts and clothing of those around, and making the black covering on the casket move ever so slightly, just enough to make one wonder if the man himself were really dead. As the procession up the hill began, the 2 horses began to struggle, digging deep furrows into the earth, as though the simple cart and casket were too heavy for them to budge. Unable to move the casket, 2 more horses were attached, and slowly the hearse began to move again, each horse straining to make the wheels turn with its unnatural weight. Overhead, the sky began to grow from a promise of rain into a churning sky as thunder began. Just before they reached the cemetery, a bolt of lightning snapped down out of the black clouds, cutting a tree in two, knocking the trunk violently across the path, blocking the road. The onlookers were worried and began to mutter about the evil, and the pallbearers simply picked up the casket and carried it to the open gravesite where the pastor stood waiting to lay the man to rest. As the pastor began to give Phibbs his final words, the river below the gathering began to bubble and churn as if it were boiling, the currents moving so fast the water itself was muddy. The hunger above grew worse in a movement through the eyes of the crowd. The casket, under its dark cloth, was moving. It was vibrating as though something inside wanted out, badly. They heard the scrambling of what sounded like claws against the wood, and with a roar, a gigantic black dog blasted out of the casket, bolting out from under the black cloth as the attendants screamed in terror. The dog snarled at them with its gleaming eyes before bolting off across the grounds, vanishing into the woods. The casket itself was unharmed. It seemed to be an impossible. Shaking and now thoroughly scared, the onlooker rushed to the pastor, who himself was shaken, ashen white. Finishing the ceremony, Phibbs' coffin was hastily buried, and as the onlookers moved to go back down the hill, the first drop of ice-cold rain began to fall. There was another sound. Some would swear to their children and neighbors, a sound that mingled with the thunder, the sound of laughter, and they said the voice belonged to Joshua Phibbs. 2 weeks later, Rotherwood was still moving on, though without one of its cruelest taskmasters. It was somewhat quieter. The remaining family began to whisper of things moving in the shadows of the house, of hearing animal feet running through the hallways, and most horrifying of all, that the laughter and sound of Joshua Phibbs himself, stalking his way around the home as he would appear at night at the foot of the bed and yank the bedsets off, keeping anyone from sleeping. But it wasn't only the family that had these troubles. The slaves were coming in to the point of a riot to claim that the ghost of Joshua Phibbs had risen from the grave along with a giant black dog to torment them every night. Fed up with such reports, the new overseers in the family came to their own fears and agreed that Phibbs' grave would be dug up to prove that once and for all the man was truly dead. Opening the grave turned out to offer more mysteries and terror than anyone imagined. The coffin was still there, and once opened, it was empty, all but a few large black animal hairs. Stunned, no one knew what had become of his body, as the dirt on the grave had not even been disturbed. Not long after, violence struck Rotherwood, as the slaves was unable to bear the torment from their unseen attackers, destroying Phibbs's headstone, desecrating his grave, and finally, at last, killing their last torturer, Phibbs's equally cruel mistress. They beat her to death, and what happened to her body is unknown. Rotherwood itself was purchased by the U.S. government in 1940, and Mrs. Ellis and her family moved away to North Carolina years later. Mrs. Ellis would resettle in Kingsport and share her story, but it wasn't the end of Rotherwood. Passing through several owners, the current owner is a prominent OB/GYN at the local medical campus. She began to renovate and restore the home to its former glory. She has fully succeeded in her goal, turning her home into a stunning memorial to the past, as well as once again giving Rotherwood an inhabitant to call it home. Even in modern times, however, Rotherwood still holds darkness in its heart. During the renovations, the owner and her friend were both at the house as workmen were working on plumbing and wiring in the basement, where their former slave cells were located. One of the workmen claimed that his partner suddenly looked up from his work and froze in place, his skin white as a ghost, and his eyes widened like a deer in headlights. Without preamble, his partner began to scream and run, fleeing up the stairs as if he was running for his life. Astounded, the owner and her friend and the workman watched as the man leaped into the van, spun gravel out, and fled, leaving his tools and his partner and a stunned owner behind. Later, the man was calm enough to tell everyone what had happened. He said he had been working and he looked up when he felt someone staring at him. When he did, he saw a man materialize out of the wall, dressed in a dark suit. Next to him was a gigantic black dog with glowing eyes, its mouth open, fangs exposed, snarling deep in its throat. The man had looked at him and grinned a sadistic smile and pointed at him. Instantly the dog had leaped for his throat, and that's why he ran. Because the dog that no one else could see was chasing him down like a rabbit. He said the dog followed him up out of the basement to the van and even a little bit down the road before vanishing into thin air. The workman said he would never set a foot on the property again, and he never did. This hound of hell and the apparitions of not only Joshua Phibbs, but also that of Rowena Ross, Priscilla, and the spirits of slaves murdered on the grounds are said to wander the property. Most of them are harmless, besides, of course, Phibbs and his hellhound. During thunderstorms, one can hear the hound baying, almost screaming, and Phibbs is there, unseen, laughing his cruel laugh. Rotherwood, once a beautiful and happy home, was left to die in darkness, only to be reborn as a home again, but this time scared for what it had breastfed, and over the years it had been used as both a refuge and a hellish nightmare come to life. What it breathed out was worse than any ghost, but rather a monster that still makes local people uneasy about it, and the Phibbses' third name. Back when Rotherwood was still a working plantation, there was a movement locally to help escaped slaves get to Canada as a part of the Underground Railroad. Escaped slaves would move under the cover of night and make their way down what is now Big Elm Road, right next to the Hudson River. They would hide in the natural enclosed valley that is where the minor tunnel would later be built, and wait on a ferryman to come and take them across the river so they could continue their journey to freedom. One evening, a slave and his wife and 3 children had escaped a local plantation and nearly made it to the hiding spot when the slave owner who had discovered them missing finally cornered them on horseback. Despite pleading for their lives, the slave owner brutally murdered them all, shooting the husband and wife, plus their 2 other children. The youngest child was a baby, and it lay screaming, covered in blood, in its mother's arms, the bullet having missed it barely. The slave owner coldly picked up the child and slung it over and over into the rocks lining the valley, smashing its brains out and tossing its body aside. Many in Kingsport know the story, or at least the rumors. And ladies and gentlemen, that is all I have on Rotherwood Plantation. I hope you enjoyed, and thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe for more. Until next time, you'll have a blessed day.
All of this is research found on the internet.